Now, when you next go to a cafe, station yourself in a table near a table where an elderly married couple are sitting. And then do something very rude, which I'm sure you've been brought up never to do. Listen in, try and overhear. And if they've been married a long time, you'll find that the conversation consists mainly of a series of grunts. The reason being that they each know what the other's going to say before they say it. Now, that could be sheer familiarity. If you've been living with somebody for 50 years, you tend to have a fairly good idea what they're likely to say. But it could be telepathy. Well, telepathy has a bad name because there's been some hoaxes. The best hoax, I think, was when two young people in their garden, they put two sheds either end of the garden, and the sheds were soundproof, and in each shed there was a table and a chair and 6 cards on the table, and each card had on it a shape, like a circle, a square, a rectangle, a triangle, or whatever. 6 of them. And what would happen is that person number 1 over here in the shed here would pick a card and think about it. Might be a circle, you think very carefully, circle, circle, circle. And the person in the shed over here would predict, yes, a circle. And 100% of the time, they got it right. Now, all sorts of people came to inspect it. Were there any hidden wires, microphones, or whatever? Absolutely nothing. It seemed completely authentic. And it was taken as proof that telepathy really exists. But it was a hoax. And how it was done was this. In each of these sheds, there was an electric clock. And the time, particularly the second hand, were exactly coordinated. So when that person over here picked a circle and then pressed the buzzer to indicate he was thinking of a shape, what he did, well, if you think of the second hand there, yes, isn't it? Say 12 to 2 represented circle, 2 to 4 represented square, and so on. So he would press the buzzer where the second hand was indicating what the shape was. And that was how it was done. Rather clever. Eventually it was discovered and the whole thing was lost. But that was the story. Now, that gives telepathy a bad name. But actually, there are other experiments more convincing. Sarah and I used to do an experiment, a party piece. We don't do it now because actually I think it was putting God to the test. And obviously not do that. But anyway, I'll explain what the thing was. There would be Sarah and me and a pack of cards. And let's say Sarah would go into the room. I'd invite somebody to pick out like that and tell me what the suit was, spades, hearts, diamonds, clubs. And I would think spades, or whatever it was. And then Sarah would have to pick this up and come back into the room. Now, you would expect, if it were random, if there was no communication between us, 25% of the time I get it right and 75% wrong. In fact, I tended to get it right, or Sarah, if she was doing it, about 35%. Interesting. But there's a much more convincing experiment that was done a few years ago by a man called Rupert Sheldrake. Let's imagine there's Mabel, and the researcher asked Mabel to give him the telephone numbers of 4 close friends or relatives. Excellent. And he says to Mabel, wait by your telephone this evening, and at 7 o'clock, one of those 4 will telephone you, and you've got to guess which one it is. Okay? Then the researcher goes off to the 4 people and arranges for one of them to telephone Mabel. Okay? Now, again, if it were random, 25% of the chance of guessing who it is, 75% of getting it wrong. The results were actually 42% and 58%. In other words, there was a 42% getting it right, more than would be random. Interesting. Now, your instinct may be, all this is terrible, it's the work of the devil, and so on. But actually, there are 3 instances, at least, in the New Testament of telepathy, all involving Jesus. 2 are in St. Luke's Gospel. One is he's reading the minds of his disciples who are quarrelling. Another is he's reading the minds of his opponents, and he anticipates what they're thinking. But the most intriguing one is in the Gospel that Jenny read to us about the Samaritan woman. If you remember, he says, you've got 5 husbands and your present partner is not your husband. And she's amazed. And then, what she says, is you're a prophet. Now just think about that for a moment. There's a bit of telepathy, and Jesus doesn't contradict her saying that he's a prophet, a bit of telepathy, and she interprets that as meaning he's a prophet, and he seems to agree with that. Now, we tend to think of prophets as rather loud people, insisting on getting their way, full of ideas. But here he's saying part of prophecy is to listen, and not just to listen, but to listen telepathically, mind to mind. That's what seems to be being said in this little passage, this little part of that conversation. In other words, prophecy seems to involve some sort of telepathy. And as I say, this is very strange, because we think of prophecy as being voluble. Now that brings us to something even more intriguing. Prophecy is one of those gifts listed in Corinthians and then in Romans as to what every church needs, the spiritual gifts. And prophecy comes second only to apostleship. It's a very important gift. And we should expect to find it amongst us. There's prophets here amongst us who have this gift of telepathy. That's what the Bible seems to be saying. I don't know which of you it is, but it's somebody. More than one, could be several. And it might change. It might be that as one part of your life you've got the gift of prophecy and therefore can, as it were, intuit what people are thinking. Another part of your life you may have some other gift. So the gifts aren't sort of static, but somebody, more than one, because every church needs one, we have a prophet in our midst. Yikes. Well, let's think what prophecy actually means in practice, this kind of telepathic prophecy. One thing it means, which is, I suppose, the obvious meaning, is a prophecy for a church, for a community such as ours, or a bigger church like the Church of England. What is the vision for it? What does God want of that church, that community, that denomination? And that's the prophet's role, is to say that. And we've got to be vigilant to pick up the prophet's words when they come. They're not going to come with a label. We have to respond to them. That's what the Bible indicates. So we've got to be vigilant to hear the prophet's words. Now, one of the problems with the Church of England, which you know and remember, is that it seems to have created a whole bureaucracy, a great institution, whose main function is to suppress prophecy. So we're completely lacking in vision. But we here at Stamford must be better than that. We should expect prophecy. We should expect people to guide us as to where we should be going. So that's one sort of prophecy. Now let's take two other forms of prophetic work, prophetic telepathy, that are actually more closer to home, that any of us can be involved with. One is prophetic evangelism. Now let me tell a story about my own conversion. In the months leading up to it, when I was in this Christian community in India, I wasn't really thinking about Christianity, but then a moment came. The community was Christian, but I was still thinking Hinduism was my thing. Didn't want Christianity, I just happened to be there. But then gradually, that began to change. Christianity came to seem a bit more attractive, a little less sort of new. And so I began to be open. There was a man in the community called Brother Jacob. He had a long Tamil name, Balasubramaniam or something. But anyway, Brother Jacob, much easier. And he was very inconspicuous. He was rather small. He was rather junior in the pecking order. He did the jobs that nobody else wanted to do, like cleaning the loos. He was that kind of chap. But it turned out he had this gift of prophetic evangelism. And just when I was getting to the point when I felt I needed to read the New Testament cover to cover, Matthew to Revelations, he, unbeknown to me, took a bus into the nearest town, which was 20 miles away. With his own money, and he didn't have much money, he found and bought a copy of the Good News Bible New Testament, which has just come out. It's the latest thing. He came back on the bus and presented it to me, just at the moment when I was thinking I needed to read the Bible. He knew that I needed that, and he presented the Bible to me to read. And as I read through the Bible, naturally, questions came into my mind. But almost before I could formulate the questions, Jacob would turn up and start talking to me about the very thing that I was kind of teasing about, worrying about. He seemed to know what I needed and what I was thinking before I even thought of it myself. And the effect was, I felt I was being carried to Christ, with this strange sense that he was, as it were, drawing me on, pushing me on. And so eventually, of course, I arrived, which is why I'm here today. Now that seems to me an example of prophetic evangelism. He knew what was in my mind. And that's what we mean by telepathy, mind-to-mind communication. He knew what was in my mind. And God was using that to bring about my conversion. Now, I think there's lots of situations where you're talking to a non-Christian, where you get a sense of what they're thinking and feeling, and you're able to echo that back to them and give it a kind of Christian understanding. Maybe when you get home, think of instances where that's happened in your life, either where you've been helped or you've helped somebody else. So that's prophetic evangelism. Now, prophetic pastoral care. The other day in the church where I sit, a lady came in who I know slightly, who suffers quite severe mental problems, psychotic episodes and so on. But she's out of hospital at the moment and coping, but only just. And there she was, she turned up, and I said hello, and I was going to make her a cup of tea. And then somebody else turned up, who I know quite well, who is a very convinced Christian, very sort of sturdy and stable and no-nonsense sort of Christian. And she sat down, and I went off to make them both a cup of tea. And where the kitchen was, I could hear through the door the conversation going on between these two people, the person with psychosis and the sort of solid person responding. And what clearly happened, and I can't quite define this, but what clearly happened is the sort of good, solid Christian instantly entered the wavelength of the person with psychosis. You could almost feel it happening. There was this sense that one was understanding the other, exactly on the same wavelength, tuned in together. And the lady with psychosis, you could almost see her grow. She felt she was being heard and understood. And all the professionals, I'm sure, if you're a professional nurse or something, it might be wonderful. You don't necessarily have that gift of prophecy. But this woman did. She got right into the same wavelength. And the woman with psychosis, as I say, was becoming enlarged with the Spirit. And actually, that seems to be being sustained. I remain in touch with a woman with psychosis regularly, either through emails or she pops in. And it seems to have had the right effect. It's, as it were, boosted her. So that's an example of prophetic pastoral care. And again, we can each of us find ourselves in a situation, and I'm sure each of you have been in this situation, where you instantly get on the wavelength of somebody else. And that's the moment when you can really help them. Don't ignore it, respond to it. Now, telepathy, I think, is not just humans have it. I think it's sometimes between humans and animals. Now, do any of you own a dog? Perhaps some of you do. If you do own a dog, of course, you own a dog. Now, see if let's see if what I'm about to describe works. There you are, you're sitting at home in the living room, and there's the dog with you, and there's somebody, a member of the family, who's about to come home. Due to come home, say in the next 2 hours. Now, about 5 or 10 minutes before the person appears, the dog begins to get excited. Scrambles up to the window, claws the window, and you're thinking, what's going on? You can't hear anything, but the dog is convinced something's happening. The dog knows that this person is about to come, becomes more and more excited. And it's only after 5 or 10 minutes that actually you become aware of, say, the car coming up the drive or whatever it might be. Is that a familiar experience to some of you? It sounds fairly familiar. Now, there's an experiment to show that that's telepathy. And the experiment is this. The dog's downstairs, and you're upstairs looking at a computer. And randomly, the computer screen pops up the word walkies. So you're thinking of walkies. Immediately, the dog downstairs rushes up and calls the door and demands a walk. Now, that looks to me like telepathy between humans and dogs. That's nothing to worry about. Telepathy may be as common as mud. What matters is that for we as Christians, telepathy through this gift of prophecy takes us to God. That's what matters, and don't ignore it.